My dad sent a group text. Don't bother showing up if you can't act grateful. I didn't reply. Just opened my laptop and canceled the tuition payments for both my siblings. 4 days later, they were screaming in my voicemail while I was on a beach, watching the sunset. I, 29M, stared at my phone screen, reading Dad's group text for the third time. The words burned into my retinas. Don't bother showing up if you can't act grateful. Below it, a long rant about how ungrateful his kids had become, how he never appreciated his sacrifices, and how Christmas dinner was only for family members who could show proper respect. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, muscle memory ready to type an apology I didn't mean. Instead, I set the phone down and walked to my laptop. The whole mess started 3 weeks ago when I'd questioned Dad's new girlfriend moving into Mom's old house. Mom had been gone 2 years, cancer taking her slowly while Dad complained about hospital bills. Now this woman, barely older than me, was redecorating with his blessing and our inheritance money. When I'd mentioned it felt rushed, Dad exploded. Called me selfish, said I was trying to control his life. My siblings, Emma and Jake, had stayed silent during that phone call, but later sent private messages agreeing with me. Typical. They'd let me be the bad guy while benefiting from the confrontation. The group text was his nuclear option. Emma and Jake would probably grovel, show up with expensive gifts they couldn't afford, smile through gritted teeth while his girlfriend played house in Mom's kitchen. They'd expect me to do the same. I opened my laptop and navigated to the education loan management portal. 2 accounts stared back at me. Emma's medical school tuition and Jake's engineering program. Both had balances that would make most people nauseous. Both were auto-deducted from my business account every month. Neither of them knew I was paying. After Mom died, Dad had sat us down for the financial reality check. His construction business was struggling, medical debt was crushing him, and there was no college fund. Emma was halfway through medical school. Jake had 2 years left in engineering. They'd need loans, he said, probably crushing debt. I'd started my software consulting company 3 years earlier. It was doing well enough that I could handle their tuition without breaking my lifestyle. But I'd made Dad promise to keep it quiet. I didn't want to be the family ATM, didn't want every financial crisis landing on my doorstep. The monthly transfers were automated. Emma thought she'd received some miraculous need-based aid. Jake believed his grades had earned him a merit scholarship that covered most costs. Dad knew the truth, but kept his mouth shut, probably because it meant he didn't have to drain his retirement. Now, staring at those account numbers, I felt something cold settle in my chest. My finger clicked the first cancellation button. A pop-up appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel recurring payments for account ending in 4829? Emma's account. Emma, who'd sent me a private message 2 days ago saying she understood my position but couldn't afford to pick sides. Emma, who'd sit at Christmas dinner laughing at his girlfriend's jokes while I was branded the ungrateful son. Click. Confirmed. Jake's account was next. Jake, who'd called me yesterday asking if I was really going to skip Christmas. When I'd explained my position, he'd gotten uncomfortable, said family was family, said maybe I should just apologize. Easy words from someone whose biggest worry was passing thermodynamics. Click. Confirmed. The system processed both cancellations immediately. January's tuition bills would bounce. They'd get notifications in about 10 days, right after Christmas. Right after they'd spent the holiday playing happy family with Dad and his girlfriend. I closed the laptop and booked a flight to Costa Rica. 4 days later, I was sitting on a beach in Manuel Antonio, watching howler monkeys swing through the trees above my beachfront rental. The sunset painted the Pacific in impossible colors, and my phone buzzed incessantly with notifications I ignored. The first voicemail came from Emma. Her voice was shaky, confused. The financial aid office had called. There'd been some mistake with her funding. Her January payment had been rejected. She'd tried calling the number they gave her, but no one could explain what happened. Could I help her figure it out? The second message was panicked. She'd talked to Jake. The same thing happened to him. Some scholarship that had been covering his tuition was suddenly gone. No explanation. The university was threatening to drop them from classes if payment wasn't received by the end of the week. The third message was angry. She'd done some digging, made some calls. Somehow, they'd traced the payments back to my business account. She was screaming now, asking how I could do this to them, how I could ruin their futures over some stupid family drama. Jake's messages followed a similar trajectory. Confusion, panic, rage. By the fourth message, he was calling me every name in the book, saying I was destroying their lives, that they'd never be able to get loans to cover the amounts, that they'd have to drop out. The fifth message was from Dad. His voice was different, smaller. He'd figured out what I'd done, probably after Emma and Jake had called him crying. He wanted to talk, he said. Maybe they could work something out. Maybe Christmas dinner could be postponed, rescheduled. Maybe his girlfriend could make herself scarce for a while. I deleted all the messages without listening to them completely and ordered another beer from the beach bar. The bartender, a local guy named Carlos who'd been chatting with me over the past few days, noticed my phone lighting up constantly. He asked if everything was okay back home. I told him family drama, nothing I couldn't handle from here. That evening, I finally read through the text messages. Emma had sent 17 messages, ranging from confused questions to pure fury. She'd called me selfish, manipulative, evil. She said I was destroying her dream of becoming a doctor, that patients would suffer because of my petty revenge. She threatened to sue me, to ruin my business, to make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. Jake's messages were shorter but more vicious. He called me a psychopath, said I'd ruined his life over nothing. He'd worked too hard to let me destroy his future. The last message was a picture of his girlfriend crying, with a caption asking if I was happy now. Dad's texts were different. He was bargaining. He'd call off Christmas dinner. He'd talk to his girlfriend about slowing things down. He'd publicly apologize for the group text. He just needed me to restore the tuition payments. I took a screenshot of his original group text and sent it back to him with a message, "This you?" Then I turned off my phone and went for a night swim. Update 1. I'd been in Costa Rica for a week when my phone exploded with activity. I turned it back on to check weather reports and was immediately hit with 43 missed calls and twice as many messages. The situation had escalated. Emma had been dropped from her clinical rotations. Medical school doesn't mess around with tuition payments, and her protests about mysterious scholarship problems fell on deaf ears. She had until Friday to pay or face academic suspension. Jake's engineering program had been more lenient, giving him 2 weeks, but the stress had caused him to fail his final exam in advanced calculus. He'd need to retake the entire course, pushing his graduation back a semester even if he could resolve the payment issue. The family group chat, which I'd been quietly removed from, had apparently become a war zone. Dad had admitted to everyone that I'd been paying their tuition. Emma and Jake were furious they hadn't known. Dad was furious I'd kept him in the dark about canceling payments. Extended family members were taking sides. Aunt Sarah had apparently called me heartless. Uncle Mike said I was justified. Grandma was threatening to change her will depending on how this resolved. The most interesting development was a message from Mom's sister, Aunt Lisa, who lived across the country. She'd heard about the situation and wanted my side of the story. Her message was different from the others, calmer, more thoughtful. She reminded me that Mom had always said I was the protector of the family, the one who quietly solved problems without needing credit. But she also said Mom wouldn't have wanted me to hurt Emma and Jake to make a point with Dad. That message bothered me more than the angry ones. I walked down to the beach and sat on a piece of driftwood, watching fishing boats return with their evening catch. A family of scarlet macaws was feeding in the almond trees behind me, their calls mixing with the sound of waves. For the first time since canceling the payments, I felt something other than cold satisfaction. My phone buzzed with another call from Emma. I let it go to voicemail, but this time I listened to the message immediately. Her voice was different, defeated. She wasn't yelling anymore. She'd talked to their academic advisors, tried to arrange emergency loans, even considered dropping out temporarily. Nothing was working. The amounts were too large, their credit histories too thin. They were looking at losing everything they'd worked for. She ended the message by saying she was sorry for the things she'd said, that she understood I was hurt, but that she was begging me to reconsider. Not for Dad, not for family peace, but because they were drowning. Jake's next message was similar. He'd swallowed his pride, apologized for calling me names. He admitted they should have supported me more with Dad, should have spoken up instead of letting me be the bad guy. He was asking for another chance, promising they'd be better family members. I stared out at the ocean, watching the last light fade from the sky. The next morning, I called my business partner, Marcus, back in Seattle. I needed someone to talk through the situation, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the family drama. Marcus had known me since college, had watched me build my business from nothing. He'd also met my family several times and had opinions about their dynamics. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, then was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said I'd made my point, probably more effectively than I'd intended. Dad clearly understood the consequences of his actions. Emma and Jake had learned they weren't as independent as they'd thought. But if I wanted to actually repair these relationships instead of just proving I could destroy them, I needed to think about what came next. He asked me what I actually wanted from this situation. I realized I didn't have a clear answer. Update 2. I extended my stay in Costa Rica by another week, partly because I needed time to think, and partly because I wasn't ready to face the aftermath of my decisions. During my second week, something unexpected happened. Dad stopped calling. The silence was more unsettling than the constant bombardment of angry messages had been. Emma and Jake were still texting occasionally, but their tone had shifted from anger to resignation. They were exploring other options. Jake was considering taking a semester off to work and save money. Emma was looking into deferring her clinical year. On Wednesday, I got a message from an unknown number. It turned out to be Dad's girlfriend, Sarah. I'd never communicated with her directly before. Her message was surprisingly thoughtful. She said she understood I didn't approve of her relationship with Dad, and that the timing probably seemed insensitive so soon after Mom's death. She wasn't trying to replace Mom or erase her memory. She was just someone who cared about Dad and had seen how lonely he'd been. She said Dad was devastated by the rift in our family, that he'd been sitting in his garage for hours every night, staring at old family photos. He was too proud to admit he'd handled the situation wrong, but he was clearly suffering. She ended by saying she'd offered to step back, to give the family space to heal, but Dad had refused. He said if his kids couldn't accept that he deserved happiness too, then maybe it was better to know now. The message bothered me because it humanized her in a way I hadn't expected. She wasn't the gold digger I'd imagined, just a woman trying to navigate an impossible situation. That evening, I called Aunt Lisa. She filled me in on family developments I hadn't heard about. Dad had apparently confided in her that he'd been paying for my siblings' tuition himself for the first year after Mom died, draining his savings and retirement accounts. When I'd started covering the payments without telling anyone, he'd been able to rebuild his finances, but he'd also felt guilty about accepting help he hadn't asked for. The revelation hit me like cold water. He'd never asked me to pay because he'd been trying to handle it himself. My anonymous assistance, which I'd thought was purely generous, had created a complicated web of debt and obligation that no one fully understood. Lisa also told me that Emma had been struggling more than she'd let on. Medical school was brutal, and she'd been dealing with imposter syndrome and depression. The tuition crisis had pushed her close to a breakdown. She was seeing a counselor and considering whether medicine was really the right path. Jake was handling things better externally, but his girlfriend had apparently told Lisa he'd been having panic attacks about his future. The engineering program was competitive, and falling behind could derail his entire career trajectory. After we hung up, I sat on my rental's deck, listening to the jungle sounds and trying to untangle my feelings. I'd wanted to prove a point about respect and family loyalty. Instead, I'd revealed how fragile everyone's situations really were. Dad wasn't the financially secure patriarch I'd assumed. He was a widower trying to rebuild his life while managing his own grief and financial stress. Emma and Jake weren't ungrateful kids coasting on my generosity. They were young adults struggling with their own pressures and insecurities. The group text that had triggered everything felt smaller now, less like a calculated insult and more like the lashing out of someone who felt unappreciated and defensive about his new relationship. But I still felt hurt. Still felt like I'd been taken for granted, like my contributions to the family had been invisible until I'd dramatically withdrawn them. My phone buzzed with a message from Emma. It was a photo of her at the hospital where she did her rotations, wearing scrubs and looking exhausted. The caption read, "Last day before suspension. Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't see it." She'd figured out the timeline. Realized I'd been paying her tuition since Mom died, covering her expenses during the hardest period of her life. The message wasn't angry or manipulative. It was genuine gratitude mixed with heartbreak. Jake sent a similar message later that day. A picture of a project he'd built in his engineering lab, with a note saying he'd never thanked me for making his education possible, that he'd been too proud or oblivious to realize how much I'd sacrificed. That night, I made a decision. Update 3. I flew back to Seattle on a Friday, 2.5 weeks after I'd left. The city felt cold and gray after Costa Rica, matching my mood as I drove home from the airport. My apartment felt sterile, mail piled up on the counter, plants drooping from neglect. I'd been living in a bubble of righteous anger and tropical weather, but reality was waiting for me in the form of 47 voicemails and an email inbox that would take hours to sort through. I didn't call anyone right away. Instead, I spent the weekend catching up on work, responding to client emails, and thinking about what I wanted to say to my family. Monday morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Emma's medical school financial aid office. I explained there had been a banking error that caused her scholarship payments to be interrupted and that I needed to restore funding immediately. The administrator was surprisingly helpful, probably because medical school students dropping out due to payment issues created paperwork headaches for everyone. The second call was to Jake's university. Same story, same result. His engineering program was more bureaucratic, requiring additional forms and verification, but they confirmed he could resume classes the following week if payment was processed immediately. The third call was to my bank, authorizing the transfers and restoring the automatic payment schedules. By noon, both Emma and Jake had received confirmation that their tuition issues were resolved. Both called me immediately. Emma was crying when I answered. She thanked me repeatedly, said she'd thought her life was over, that she'd been preparing to move back home and figure out a completely different career path. She apologized for the angry messages, said the stress had made her say things she didn't mean. Jake was more controlled but equally grateful. He said the experience had taught him not to take opportunities for granted, that he'd been coasting through school without fully appreciating the sacrifice someone was making for his education. Both asked if I was coming home, if we could talk in person, if there was any way to repair the family relationships that had been damaged. I told them I'd be in touch soon, but that I needed to have a conversation with Dad first. That evening, I drove to Dad's house. Mom's house. Our family home. Sarah's car was in the driveway, but she'd apparently made herself scarce for our conversation. Dad was waiting in the living room, looking older than I remembered, wearing one of his old work shirts that hung loose on his frame. The house looked different. Not dramatically redecorated, but subtly changed. New curtains, different throw pillows, a few pieces of furniture I didn't recognize. Mom's pictures were still on the mantel, but they'd been joined by photos of Dad and Sarah together. We talked for 2 hours. Dad apologized for the group text, said he'd been feeling defensive about Sarah and had lashed out unfairly. He admitted he'd known about my tuition payments and had felt guilty about accepting help he hadn't asked for. He'd also felt resentful that I was in a position to help when he, as the father, couldn't provide for his children the way he wanted to. I apologized for the dramatic way I'd made my point, for putting Emma and Jake's futures at risk to prove something to him. I explained that I'd felt taken for granted, that the family had gotten comfortable with me solving problems quietly while taking criticism publicly. He said he'd always been proud of my success, but hadn't known how to express it without sounding like he was asking for more help. He'd been trying to maintain his dignity as the family patriarch while privately struggling with grief, finances, and the complexity of starting a new relationship. We talked about Mom, about how her death had changed all of us in ways we hadn't fully processed. Dad said Sarah had helped him remember that life continued after loss, but he understood why his children saw her as a replacement rather than a separate relationship. By the end of the conversation, we hadn't fixed everything, but we'd established a foundation for rebuilding trust. The following week, I had dinner with Emma and Jake. We set some new ground rules for family dynamics. I would continue helping with their education, but they needed to be aware of and grateful for the assistance. They would speak up when they disagreed with family decisions instead of leaving me to be the voice of dissent. We would all make an effort to communicate more directly instead of letting resentments build. Dad and I started having monthly dinners, just the two of us. Sarah joined occasionally, and I gradually began to see her as Dad described, someone who made him happy rather than a threat to Mom's memory. Christmas dinner happened in February, a delayed celebration after everyone had cooled down and established new relationship dynamics. It was awkward but genuine, with more honest conversation than we'd had in years. Emma graduated medical school the following spring. Jake finished his engineering degree on schedule. Dad and Sarah got married in a small ceremony that honored Mom's memory while celebrating their new beginning. The whole experience taught me that dramatic gestures might prove points, but they rarely solve underlying problems. Real change required the harder work of honest communication, mutual respect, and the willingness to see situations from perspectives other than my own. I still think about those weeks in Costa Rica sometimes, watching sunsets and feeling justified in my anger. But I'm glad I chose to rebuild rather than simply prove I had the power to destroy. The family group chat was eventually restored, with better boundaries and more honest communication. Dad never sent another ultimatum. Emma and Jake never again assumed my help was guaranteed rather than appreciated. And sometimes, when family dynamics get tense, someone references the Costa Rica incident as a reminder that actions have consequences, but that most problems can be solved without nuclear options if everyone is willing to do the work.